The unrelenting sun of the Nevada Territory did not simply shine. It bore down upon the earth with the weight of a physical hammer, flattening the horizon into a shimmering haze of heat and dust. It was a summer that dried the marrow in the bones of cattle and men alike, turning the sagebrush into brittle skeletons that rattled in the hot wind. In this landscape of browns, grays, and the faded whitewash of the chaotic settlement known as Dust Creek, May Lynn stood as a singular, jarring anomaly. She wore a prairie dress of pale powder blue, a color so clean and redolent of cool water that it seemed to mock the grit coating every other surface in the town. She stood on the wooden boardwalk outside the general store, her hands clasped tightly before her, her knuckles pale against skin that had already begun to darken under the unforgiving western glare. She was 30 years old, though the shadows beneath her eyes spoke of a lifetime of fatigue compressed into the last few months. She was a widow, a status that carried with it a heavy cloak of invisibility in a town built on loud vices and desperate commerce. May Lynn watched the foreman of the Double Bar Ranch, a man named Garrick, who spat a stream of dark tobacco juice near the hem of her dress. He was a man carved from gristle and prejudice, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at her. She had heard they were hiring a camp cook, a position usually reserved for crippled older men or those too broken for the saddle. Yet he looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture that had been left out in the rain. The wind whipped a lock of jet-black hair across her face, but she did not flinch, maintaining a posture of practiced stillness that she had learned across an ocean, in a life that felt like a dream from another existence. She needed this work. The coins in her small, beaded purse were few, and the boarding house matron had made it clear that charity was a commodity as scarce as rain. Garrick laughed, a harsh, grating sound that drew the attention of the loungers on the porch. He dismissed her not with a shout, but with a wave of his hand as if shooing a fly, telling her that the ranch was no place for a woman, let alone a foreigner with no husband to speak for her. He turned his back, returning to his conversation with the storekeep, leaving May Lynn stranded in the rising heat, the humiliation burning hotter than the sun on her neck. The rejection sat heavy in her chest, a familiar stone she had carried since the mining accident that had taken her husband Lee 3 months prior. She remained rooted to the spot, not out of defiance, but out of a desperate necessity that paralyzed her legs. To walk away was to admit starvation. The town bustled around her, horses stamping, wagons creaking under the load of supplies, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, but she felt entirely encased in silence. She looked down at her hands, the hands of a woman who knew the alchemy of spices and the discipline of the blade. Hands that were useless here, where only the strength to swing a pickaxe or rope a steer was valued. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of dry pine and horse manure, trying to steady the trembling in her fingers. It was then that the rhythm of the street changed. The casual chatter on the porch died down, replaced by a respectful, almost fearful silence. The sound of heavy hooves, rhythmic and slow, approached through the dust, drawing the gaze of every man on the boardwalk. A shadow fell over May Lynn, cooling the air around her instantly. She opened her eyes to see a massive black stallion, its coat gleaming with sweat, standing just feet away. The rider was a mountain of a man, his face obscured by the brim of a black hat, his posture radiating a terrifying kind of stillness. This was Thane Blackwood. Even in the short time she had been in Dust Creek, she had heard the name whispered with a mixture of reverence and dread. He was the owner of the largest tract of land in the territory, a man known for his stoic demeanor and his ruthlessness with cattle rustlers. He did not look at the foreman. His gaze was fixed somewhere on the horizon, yet his presence commanded the immediate attention of everyone present. Garrick scrambled to attention, his previous arrogance dissolving into obsequious nervousness as he greeted the rancher. Thane did not dismount. He simply looked down at the foreman and asked, in a voice like grinding stones, if the crew was full. Garrick stammered, mentioning the lack of a cook, making a joke about the slim pickings in town. Mei Lin stepped forward. It was a movement that defied her instinct for self-preservation, a step taken by the part of her that refused to fade away into the dust. She moved into the line of sight of the black stallion, causing the beast to toss its head. Thane Blackwood shifted in his saddle, his eyes the color of cold flint, locking onto her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Garrick moved to intercept her, his face flushing with anger at her insolence, ready to shove her aside. But Thane raised a single-gloved hand, halting the foreman in his tracks. The rancher stared at the woman in the blue dress, taking in the straightness of her back and the defiance in her dark eyes. He saw the poverty in her mended shawl and the dignity in her stance. He asked simply what she wanted. Mei Lin swallowed the lump of fear in her throat. She knew this was the hinge upon which her life would turn. She could not beg. Men like this did not respect beggars. She had to offer a trade. "No one loves a widow, sir," she whispered, the words soft but carrying clearly in the hushed street. She paused, seeing a flicker of something indecipherable in his eyes. Perhaps surprise, perhaps a recognition of the profound loneliness in her statement. "But I can cook." The admission hung in the air, vulnerable and absolute. She did not promise miracles. She promised the one thing she knew to be true. The cowboy's reaction shocked everyone. He did not laugh. He did not sneer. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearm on the horn of his saddle, and studied her for a long moment, as if assessing the worth of a prize mare or a new rifle. Then he nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin. He told Garrick to get her a wagon. The foreman's jaw dropped, sputtering protests about the bunkhouse being no place for a woman, about the men's rough ways. Thane silenced him with a look that was colder than the winter wind. He stated, flatly, that if the men wanted to eat, they would behave. He looked back at Mei Lin, and for a second the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften, not with a smile, but with a somber respect. He told her to be ready in 5 minutes. The journey to the Blackwood Ranch was a transition from the chaotic noise of humanity to the vast, indifferent silence of nature. Mei Lin sat on the hard wooden bench of the supply wagon, clutching her meager belongings, a small trunk containing her husband's few keepsakes and her set of knives, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth. The wagon rattled over ruts baked hard by the sun, kicking up plumes of dust that coated her blue dress in a fine gray powder. Ahead of them, Thane Blackwood rode point, his figure silhouetted against the vast expanse of the sky. He did not look back, yet she felt a strange sense of protection in his lead. He was a barrier between her and the dangers of the open range. The landscape shifted as they rode, the scrubby flatlands giving way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine, the air growing slightly thinner and sharper. They arrived at the ranch as the sun began to dip below the western peaks, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and bleeding orange. The Blackwood homestead was a sprawling collection of structures made of rough-hewn timber and stone, built to withstand sieges of both weather and men. The main house stood on a rise, dark and imposing, but the wagon was directed toward the lower cluster of buildings, the barns and the bunkhouse. As the wagon came to a halt, the reality of her situation crashed down upon Mei Lin. The bunkhouse was a long, low building that seemed to exhale a breath of stale air even from the outside. A group of men were washing up at a trough near the corral, their torsos bare, covered in the grime of a day's branding. They stopped their splashing as the wagon pulled in, turning to stare with open hostility and confusion. Garrick jumped down from his horse, making a show of his displeasure, barking orders at the men to stop gawking. He gestured vaguely toward a lean-to structure attached to the side of the bunkhouse. "That's the kitchen," he sneered, spitting into the dust, "and the back room is yours. Don't expect no palace." Maylin climbed down, her legs stiff. She could feel the eyes of the men on her, heavy, assessing, and unkind. They were hungry, tired, and used to a world without softness. A woman, especially a Chinese woman in a delicate blue dress, was an intruder in their brotherhood of sweat and toil. One of the older hands, a man with a white beard and a limp, stepped forward to help her with her trunk. This was old Pete. His eyes were kind, crinkled at the corners, offering a brief respite from the wall of rejection. He muttered a quiet welcome, warning her that the boys were rough but mostly harmless, though his glance toward a few of the younger, harder-looking men suggested otherwise. Maylin entered the kitchen and nearly recoiled. It was a dark, cavernous space that smelled of rancid grease, burnt coffee, and neglect. The cast-iron stove was a behemoth of rust and grime, cold and forbidding. The tables were sticky, covered in the remnants of previous meals, and flies buzzed lazily in the stagnant air. It was a place where food was merely fuel, shoveled into mouths without joy or care. Panic fluttered in her chest. This was her proving ground. If she failed here, there was nowhere left to go. She placed her trunk in the small closet-like room adjacent to the pantry, which contained nothing but a narrow cot and a warped washstand. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and despair. But then she thought of the large, silent man on the black horse, and the chance he had given her. She untied the ribbon of her bonnet, rolled up the sleeves of her blue dress, and looked around. She would not let the filth defeat her. This kitchen was a battlefield, and she was a soldier who had survived worse than Greece. Morning came long before the sun. The sky was still a deep, inky indigo when Maylin rose from the thin mattress, her body aching from the cold. She lit a kerosene lantern, the golden light pushing back the shadows of the kitchen, revealing the work she had already begun the night before. She had spent hours scrubbing the tabletops with boiling water and lye soap until the wood was pale and raw. Now it was time for the true work. The kitchen was cold, the iron of the stove radiating a chill that seeped through her dress. She set to work building a fire, her movements efficient and practiced. The strike of the match, the catch of the kindling, the roar of the wood. It was a liturgy she knew by heart. As the stove began to warm, emitting a series of metallic ticks and groans, the atmosphere of the room shifted. It became a living thing, waking up alongside her. She assessed the pantry again, more thoroughly this time. The supplies were basic and brutal: sacks of flour, bins of beans, salted pork that looked like leather, sacks of potatoes, and dried onions. There was no fresh cream, no delicate greens, none of the ingredients she had once used to weave magic in her own kitchen. But a cook's skill was not in the ingredients she wished for, but in the transformation of what she had. She found a tin of lard and a heavy bag of coffee beans. She began with the coffee. She did not simply boil the grounds as the previous cook likely had. She crushed the beans fresh, using a heavy stone pestle she found, releasing an aroma that was dark, oily, and awakening. She set the water to boil, ensuring it was scalding but not burnt. Next, she turned her attention to the flour. She would make biscuits, but not the rocks the men were used to. She cut the lard into the flour with cold hands, working quickly to keep the fat from melting, creating layers that would rise and flake in the heat. She had no buttermilk, so she used water mixed with a little vinegar she had found to tenderize the dough. Her hands moved with a rhythmic grace, kneading, folding, and cutting. The dull thud of the dough against the table was the heartbeat of the morning. She sliced the salted pork thick, soaking it first in warm water to draw out the harsh excess brine, then peppering it heavily before laying it in the hot skillet. The sizzle was loud and aggressive, sending up a cloud of savory steam that began to chase away the lingering smell of stale grease. She found a bag of dried apples and rehydrated them in a syrup made from brown sugar and cinnamon, creating a compote to cut the heaviness of the pork. This was her language. She could not speak the rough slang of the cowboys, nor could she command them with physical strength, but she could speak to their hunger. She could speak to the primal need for warmth and care that existed even in the hardest of men. As the biscuits rose in the oven, turning a golden brown, the kitchen filled with a symphony of smells: the rich, nutty scent of coffee, the savory bite of frying pork, the sweet warmth of cinnamon, and the yeasty comfort of baking bread. It was a smell that defied the harshness of the territory, a smell of home that many of these men had not encountered in years. Mei Lin wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, her face flushed from the heat of the stove. She was no longer just a widow in a blue dress. She was the sorceress of the hearth, and she was ready for judgment. The sun had just crested the horizon, setting the dust motes dancing in the air, when the first sounds of the waking bunkhouse reached the kitchen. Boots stomped on wooden floorboards, groans of stiff muscles filled the air, and the door swung open. The men shuffled in, eyes bleary, expecting the usual trough of lukewarm mush and burnt coffee. Garrick was among the first, his face set in a permanent scowl, ready to find fault. But as they crossed the threshold, they stopped. The wall of scent hit them, stopping them dead in their tracks. It was not just the smell of food, it was the smell of care. The table was set. Mei Lin had found 10 plates and scrubbed them until they shone, laying them out in precise rows. In the center of the table, she had placed the platter of golden, steaming biscuits, piled high like a monument to abundance. Beside it sat the skillet of crisped pork and the bowl of stewed apples. Silence descended on the room, heavier and more profound than the silence of the street the day before. The men looked at the food, then at Mei Lin, who stood by the stove, her hands clasped in front of her apron, her eyes downcast but her chin level. She did not speak. She simply gestured to the coffee pot. Old Pete was the first to move. He walked to the table, his limp pronounced in the quiet room, and took a seat. He reached out a calloused hand and took a biscuit. He broke it open, and steam escaped, the inside fluffy and white. He took a bite, and a look of genuine shock crossed his weathered face. He chewed slowly, closing his eyes, a sound of appreciation rumbling in his throat. "Well, I'll be damned," Pete whispered, the curse sounding like a prayer. The spell broke. The other men surged forward, the scrape of benches on the floor loud and eager. They ate with a ferocity that was almost frightening, but the usual chaos was tempered by a new undercurrent. They did not throw the food. They devoured it with focus. The coffee was poured, hot and black, and murmurs of surprise rippled through the room. Garrick ate silently, his eyes darting from his plate to the woman by the stove, his antagonism warring with the undeniable pleasure of a full, hot meal. Mei Lin watched them, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was feeding the wolves, and for the moment, the wolves were tamed. The door opened again, and the room went still once more. Thane Blackwood entered. He had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe. He carried his hat in his hand, his hair damp from washing. He looked at the men, then at the table laden with actual food, and finally at Mei Lin. He walked to the head of the table, where a single plate had been set for him. He sat, and the men watched, spoons hovering halfway to mouths. Thane took a bite of the pork, then a sip of the coffee. He set the cup down without a sound. He looked up at Mei Lin, his dark eyes locking with hers across the room. There was no smile, but the hard line of his jaw seemed to relax. He nodded to her, a confirmation of the contract made in the dusty street. She had proven her worth. She was no longer just a stranger. She was the heart of the ranch, and the day had only just begun. Weeks bled into months, the relentless heat of the summer giving way to the golden, heavy haze of early autumn, and the rhythm of the Blackwood Ranch began to beat in time with the movements of Maylin's hands. The kitchen, once a dungeon of grease and apathy, had transformed into the beating heart of the homestead, a sanctuary where the air was always thick with the promise of sustenance. She had scrubbed the walls until the wood grain emerged from beneath years of soot, and she had coaxed the old stove into a temperamental but reliable ally. The men, initially rough and guarded, had begun to undergo a subtle softening, a civilization brought about by the alchemy of hot stews, fresh bread, and the quiet dignity of the woman who served them. They no longer stomped into the kitchen with mud-caked boots. They scraped them clean at the door, a silent offering of respect. They brought her small tokens from the range, a handful of wild sage, a peculiarly shaped stone, a feather from a hawk, placing them awkwardly on the work table before retreating to their benches. Even old Pete had taken to carving her a new ladle from a piece of bone, presenting it to her with a gruff mumble that hid his gratitude. Yet, amidst this growing harmony, the foreman, Garrick, remained a sour note, a festering splinter in the hand of the ranch. He watched Maylin with a gaze that had curdled from dismissal into a malignant resentment. He hated the way the men lingered over their coffee, hated the way Thane Blackwood's eyes would follow her as she moved between the pantry and the stove. To Garrick, her presence was an erosion of the hard, masculine order he believed kept the world turning, and he sought every opportunity to find a crack in her armor, criticizing the cost of the flour, or sneering at the strange aromatic spices she used to flavor the beef. Maylin bore his malice with the same stoic silence she wore like a shield, but the tension in the kitchen was a taut wire, vibrating with an unspoken threat that grew with every passing day. The breaking point of the season came not from the foreman, but from the sky itself, which turned a bruised, sickly green one late afternoon, signaling the arrival of a violent late-season tempest. The wind died suddenly, plunging the ranch into an eerie, suffocating vacuum of silence that made the horses in the corral scream and kick at the rails. Then the heavens tore open. It was not rain, it was a deluge, a solid sheet of water that hammered the roof of the bunkhouse with the deafening roar of a rockfall. The temperature plummeted, the heat of the day replaced instantly by a bone-chilling dampness that seeped through the cracks in the walls. The men were out on the ridge, driving the herd down to the lower pastures to escape the lightning that forked across the sky in blinding, jagged spears. Maylin stood at the kitchen window, watching the world dissolve into gray chaos, her hands gripping the edge of the sink until her knuckles turned white. She kept the stove roaring, piling it high with wood, knowing that when they returned, they would be half drowned and freezing. Hours stretched like pulled taffy, the darkness of the storm swallowing the daylight completely. Finally, above the roar of the wind, she heard the frantic shouting of men and the panicked lowing of cattle. The door to the kitchen burst open, carried by a gust of wind that nearly extinguished the lanterns, and a group of soaked, shivering men stumbled in, carrying a heavy burden between them. It was Thane. He was pale, his face a mask of pain, his left leg dragging uselessly behind him, the denim of his jeans dark with blood where a spooked steer had driven a horn into his thigh. The sanctuary of the kitchen was instantly transformed into a field hospital, the smell of bread overpowered by the metallic tang of blood and the scent of wet wool. Maylin did not freeze. The panic that fluttered in her chest was ruthlessly suppressed by the necessity of the moment. She took command, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the confusion of the frightened hands. She ordered old Pete to clear the heavy oak table, sweeping the dinner preparations aside without hesitation. She directed two younger men to lift Thane onto the surface, her small frame darting between them with the agility of a bird. Thane was conscious but groggy, his teeth gritted against the agony as they laid him down. He looked at her, his eyes glassy, attempting to wave her away, to tell her it was nothing, but she silenced him with a firm hand on his chest. She was no longer the cook. She was the authority. She called for boiling water and clean linens, tearing strips from her own spare apron when the rags proved insufficient. As she cut away the ruined fabric of his trousers to reveal the angry, jagged gash, a collective gasp went through the room. It was a wicked wound, deep and bleeding freely. Garrick stood in the corner, useless and pale, muttering about needing a doctor from town, a 2-day ride that was impossible in this weather. Maylin ignored him. She cleansed the wound with the boiling water and a splash of whiskey, her hands steady despite the tremors shaking the floorboards with every clap of thunder. She threaded a needle with silk thread from her sewing kit, sterilization by fire, and began to stitch him up. Thane watched her face, his vision blurring, focusing only on the furrow of her brow and the compassion etched into her tight lips. He did not cry out, though the sweat rolled off him in sheets. In that hour, amidst the storm and the blood, the distance between master and servant, between cowboy and widow, evaporated, replaced by the primal intimacy of survival. The recovery was slow, a test of patience for a man who defined himself by action. For the next week, Thane was confined to a makeshift bed in the corner of the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, so Maylin could keep a watchful eye on his fever. The dynamic of the ranch shifted on its axis. With Thane incapacitated, Garrick strutted with a renewed sense of power, barking orders and pushing the men to their limits in the mud-slicked fields. But in the kitchen, his authority ended at the threshold. Maylin became the gatekeeper. She brewed willow bark tea for Thane's pain and made rich, restorative broths that she spooned into him when his hands were too shaky to hold the bowl. During the quiet hours between meals, while the rain tapped a softer rhythm against the glass, they spoke. It was halting at first, filled with the awkward pauses of two people who had forgotten how to share themselves. Thane spoke of the land, of the burden of the legacy his father had left him, of the hollowness of the big house on the hill. Maylin spoke of the ocean, of the scent of star anise, of the husband she had loved who was now part of the earth. She told him of the loneliness that felt like a physical weight, a coat she could never take off. Thane listened, his gaze intense, seeing for the first time the steel spine beneath the delicate blue dress. He realized that her strength was different from his. His was the strength of the oak that resists the wind, while hers was the strength of the willow that bends and survives. The fever broke on the fourth night, leaving behind a clarity that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The inevitable confrontation with Garrick came the evening Thane finally sat up at the table for dinner, his leg bandaged but healing. The foreman had been drinking, a flask of cheap whiskey emboldening his resentment. He stormed into the kitchen, his boots leaving muddy tracks on Maylin's clean floor, and threw a sack of flour onto the table, sending a white cloud puffing into the air. He accused Maylin of theft, claiming the supplies were dwindling too fast, insinuating that she was smuggling food to some non-existent lover or hoarding it for herself. It was a clumsy, desperate lie, born of jealousy and the realization that he was losing his grip on the crew. The room went deathly silent. The men, who had come to view Maylin with a protective fierceness, shifted on their benches, looking to Thane. Maylin stood by the stove, her face pale but composed, clutching a wooden spoon like a scepter. She did not defend herself. She knew the truth of her ledger was absolute. Garrick sneered, calling her a slur that hung in the air like a foul odor, reaching out to grab her arm. Before his fingers could graze her sleeve, a sound like a cracking whip echoed through the room. Thane had slammed his hand onto the table. He did not shout. He stood up, wincing slightly as he put weight on his injured leg, but rising to his full, formidable height. His voice was a low rumble, vibrating with a dangerous calm. He told Garrick to pack his roll. He did not argue about the flour. He simply stated that no man who insulted the dignity of this house would sleep under its roof. Garrick blustered, looking to the other men for support, but found only stony faces and cold stares. Old Pete stood up, crossing his arms, a silent wall of solidarity. The rejection was total. Garrick looked at Maylin, then at Thane, and saw a bond he could not break. He turned and fled into the night, leaving behind a silence that was not empty, but filled with a profound, settling peace. With the venom of the foreman gone, the ranch breathed a collective sigh of relief, entering a period of golden tranquility. The incident had shattered the last barriers of reserve between Thane and Maylin. It was a Sunday evening, the air crisp with the coming winter, when the true shift occurred. The men had retired to the bunkhouse after a celebratory meal, leaving the two of them alone in the warm, lantern-lit kitchen. Maylin was drying the final platter, the rhythmic clink of china the only sound in the room. Thane sat at the table nursing a final cup of coffee, watching the way the firelight played on her dark hair. He stood up, the chair scraping softly, and walked over to her. He did not touch her, but he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, a solid, comforting presence. "You said no one loves a widow," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he had never learned to articulate. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped parcel. It was not a grand gesture, but a practical one. A set of silver combs for her hair, ordered from the catalog in town, items of beauty she had long denied herself. Maylin turned, her hands wet and trembling. She looked up at him, seeing the man who had been a terrifying shadow on a horse, now revealed as a protector, who saw her not as a servant, but as a woman of immense worth. "Perhaps," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes, "I was wrong." The admission hung between them, a bridge over the chasm of their pasts. Thane reached out, his large, calloused hand gently covering hers. There was no need for grand declarations or poetic speeches. In the quiet of the kitchen, amidst the scent of drying herbs and cooling embers, a new contract was signed, not for labor, but for a shared life. The widow in the blue dress had found a home, and the cowboy had found the one thing the vast open range could never give him, a heart to beat alongside his own.